I'm sure you all know that today is World Polio Day. So we have Bob Meroney is here from Fort Collins Rotary Club. He did this presentation for the Fort Collins Club a couple of weeks ago. I thought it was way more interesting than anything I could do. So please welcome Bob, and he's going to give you a good update on viruses. Bob, you'll need the mic.
This was also part of an inspirational moment. I work with the Inspirational Moment group and have had done about 50 of them. So this is on polio memories. And I wanted to give you a few scientific facts. Recently, scientists have established there are 5 million trillion bacteria that live. That's 5 with 30 zeros after it, living on Earth. That means essentially that we are a tiny fraction of the living organisms on this planet, but that's not all. There are an estimated 10 nonillion. That's an interesting number. I don't know how many times you use that with your friends. That's 10 with 31 zeros after it, also live on Earth, and these are all smaller than bacteria. And of course, we have our bodies and our cells, and we have cells in our bodies. And there are all kinds of purposes. And there's about 30 trillion cells in the individual bodies in this room. And there are around 38 trillion bacterial cells, which live on our skin, in our guts, stomach, saliva, and lungs. Fortunately, most of these are beneficial, and they actually assist us. But think about that. You have more cells in your body that are not your human cells than are actually your human cells. But that's not all. There are 380 trillion viruses which share our bodies. This gives you an idea here of here's a typical bacteria and the viruses that live on that. Now, just to give you a feeling, doctors talk about what is called the lethal dose, 50% of a given bacteria can cause you to get sick and die. If you look at the total number of cells and bacteria in the body, they're about 30 trillion or 44%, which weighs 70 kilograms that are in a typical human. Benign bacteria, they're about 38 trillion. That's 56% of all the cells. That's only about 0.2 kilograms. So you get an idea of how much smaller the bacteria are. And then if you went to viruses, they're even smaller amount, but still more. But if you looked at the bad bacteria, the ones that we need to worry about, take and expand it, just to give you a feeling, a lethal dose of Shigella only requires 10 to 100 bacteria. You think to yourself, my God, they're competing with all those other cells and bacteria, and they can still make us sick. It takes for salmonella about 100,000 in your body to make you sick. And for E. coli, for example, which most of you have heard of, it takes 10 million to 10 billion to make you sick. So it's good to think about this. Siphonoptera, that's the word in Latin for fleas, okay? Great fleas have little fleas upon their backs to bite them, and little fleas have lesser fleas, and so on, ad infinitum. And the great fleas themselves, in turn, have greater fleas to go on, while these again have greater still, and so on. Now let's move on to the polio virus. This is a small fraction of all the viruses. And I might say in advance that one of the unique things about the polio virus, it's a virus that only lives in humans. When we talk about COVID-19, for example, one of the problems with it is that it not only lives in humans, it lives in other animals. So it's extremely difficult to remove that bacteria or that virus from all over the world. But polio, since it only lives in humans, we have a chance to get rid of it. We actually can get rid of it. All right? Now, poliomyelitis has existed for thousands of years. And here we see a picture of a disease in ancient art. This is about from 1,400 years before the Common Era. And see here the distorted leg and the crutch that this person is using. Poliovirus was first recognized as a distinct disease in 1789 in the United Kingdom by a man named Michael Underwood. It was first identified in the specifically in 1909 in Austria by Karl Landsteiner. Unfortunately, in the end of the 1800s and early 1900s, suddenly there was huge outbreaks of polio, and it really came to our attention. It had been around for thousands and thousands of years, but it really became attention-grabbing in only this last century. Now let's take a look at a particular poliovirus, and that should look familiar to you because you've probably all seen COVID-19 pictures in the past, and it has a similar shape. It's asymptotic in 75% of the cases. That means that most of the people that get polio, they get sick, but they get over it. And so in 25% of the cases, infection causes sore throat and low fever, and recovery occurs in about 2 weeks. In 1% of the cases, the virus migrates from the gastrointestinal tract to the central nervous system. It crosses over the brain barrier and into the spine, and this is where we get the version of it that we dislike the most. Most of people develop non-paralytic meningitis, headaches, neck, back, abdominal pain, fever, vomiting, stomach pain, lethargy, and irritability. That's bad enough. It's not something I'd want to get. But 1 in 5 and 1,000 of those people develop paralytic disease, which occurs within 7 to 21 days. So you'll see that it doesn't happen to everybody. It is not adamantly a death-defying result if you get polio, but it is serious if you get it bad. And the paralytic polio, which most of us cringe about, the survivors are one of the largest disabled groups in the world. At 10 to 20 million polio victims. That means around the world, during its height, there were 10 to 20 million people who had polio. If people had polio and they were young, there's also a distinct possibility, even if they get over it, think they're completely cured, they get up to about 60 years old, it comes back. And that's not good. The 1952 polio epidemic resulted in 58,000 cases that year in the United States. 3,000 died, and 21,000 were left with mild to paralyzing disabilities. In 1977, there were 254,000 persons in the US still paralyzed by polio. I think this lady is worth considering. If you see at the top, the young girl is in an iron lung. When I was a kid, it was not uncommon at all to have friends that ended up in iron lungs. And in fact, I can remember distinctly, in order to stop the spread, almost all swimming pools were shut down. No one was allowed to go swimming because we thought that was one of the ways it could be passed along. This lady entered an iron lung in 1953. She's still alive today, but to stay alive, she has to re-enter her lung every night in order to breathe. Now, how do we conquer polio? Well, in 1950, William Hammond purified the gamma globulin of the blood plasma of polio survivors. It turned out to be about 80% effective. And trouble was that you needed blood from somebody that already had polio. That meant it couldn't be given easily to everybody else. In 1950, Henry Kaprowski developed a prototype vaccine. This was a liquid vaccine where people just drank it and they got a fairly high level of coverage. In 1952, Jonas Salk developed a second vaccine, an inactivated poliovirus, and it was given by injection. You were 90% immune after 3 doses, and the big advantage of this is it was extremely rare, almost unheard of, for anybody to get polio after having the inoculation. You didn't get it from the injection. But he also developed an oral vaccine. And the reason this is so important is it can be given easily. It doesn't require sterilized needles, special nurses to give it, so it could be given all over the underdeveloped world. Unfortunately, in 1 in 750,000 cases, it can revert to a paralytic form. This typically doesn't hurt the person that it gets this. It passes out through the feces into the toilet areas, and people come in contact with it, and then they can get polio again. And this is, some people call it wild polio, some people call it sort of secondary infection. It's not as effective in stopping wild vaccine. So Dr. Sabin developed a live oral vaccine in 1957 that blocks the oral fetal route. In other words, even if it changes, it won't come out through the fetal route. And this is the primary oral vaccine used today. So we now have to reach today, and we remember that in 1988, the Global Polio Eradication Program was begun, and it was led by the World Health Organization and by Rotary. Hooray! And polio and guinea worm diseases are the only two diseases today that are targeted for global eradication. You might ask, have we done it at all for anything else? The only global disease eradicated to date are smallpox, and it was attributed to have been completely eradicated in 1980, and rinderpest, which was eradicated only recently in 2021. Let's do it for polio. So the important thing to know is that today is World Polio Day, the 24th of October. And if we look at the last several decades, we can see when the last recorded cases of polio occurred in different countries. And you'll notice that the last recorded cases of polio in the United States occurred in the 70s. Then it was wiped out in Europe and most of South America and some of Africa in the 80s. In the 90s, we started picking up the Far East to a large extent. And then we come up to more recent dates, and we find that we're still fighting it. We're still fighting it in Central Africa and Pakistan, Nepal, India. And these are the final areas where we're still trying to fight it. And it has two reasons that it's continued to persist. First of all, wild polio. That there are 3 types of wild polio, 1, 2, and 3. Unfortunately, wild polio 2 and 3 we have managed to wipe out. Only wild polio 1 is left. And it's mainly because we've developed new vaccines that do not tend to shed the changed vaccine into the fetal materials and go on out. So the big one still left is wild polio 1. And the 2 areas that have been problems in recent years have been Nigeria and Pakistan. And one of the reasons it's been a problem there is there has been a conspiracy theory that among certain Muslim groups that the polio vaccine was deliberately made to kill the fertility of males, and so it was going to stop Muslims and Pakistanis from reproducing. And so they literally have attacked and fought people who were trying to distribute the vaccine in those countries. Same thing happened in parts of Nigeria where there is some extremism there too. But we're really down to a pretty good condition today. And so I'm going to turn it over to Ruth, and she'll finish off our discussion.
Okay, that's great, Bob. Thank you. Yeah, so we just want to, well, Let's go back up. Yeah. So just want to point out how we're doing. Remember back in 2021, things were looking so good. We were down to only 6 cases in the world in 2021. And then we lost a lot of ground last year, back up to 30 cases. So far this year, we're at 8. I fear it's going to go higher than that. So we're still fighting just to get down to 0 cases. And when we get there, we have to keep vaccinating all the new children coming into the world for about 3 years, 5 years that we have to keep vaccinating before it's eradicated from the planet. So that's our job. And of course, as polio goes away and nobody has it, that's going to get harder and harder to do. Rotary is going to be very much challenged. So one of the things to help us stay on that track is Polio Plus Society. And Polio Plus Society, you might recall we gave certificates to 15 Polio Plus Society members in our club last summer. And these folks have already signed up. So we're on our way to helping sustain the investment that it's going to take to eradicate polio from the planet. And across District 5440, we're doing really well in the Fort Collins, Loveland area, but at the district level, we have a lot of work to do across Wyoming. Our next big thing for polio is going to be the Purple Pins event. It's the Sunday before the Super Bowl, February 4th, a Sunday, 2 to 4 p.m., and please be there. Already over just in the last 4 years, with our local contributions and the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation double match, we've raised about $135,000 for polio eradication. So that's great. And I brought with me today, just in case you'd like to sign up and become a member of the Polio Plus Society, I'll just put these out, and please take a form. All you do is pledge to contribute $100 a year to Polio Plus funds. So thank you.